Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, shills, desolate, search, fences, vassals, minions. I'm a useful idiot, welcome. And I'm doing an ongoing series about topics involving Israel. Because I know other people's attention has gone back to the Ukraine and has gone back to events elsewhere, including Iraq. The situation in Gaza, of course, is ongoing. And it's still been a shock to the system. And I'm going to be doing a couple more videos in the Israeli series right now. But I'm trying to take a more sober approach than you get from a number of other outlets. I am not an anti-Semite, as I've brought up in other videos. I have two advanced degrees studying Germanics and art history. And I've steeped myself in Jewish culture for most of my life. And many of my cultural icons, and painters and writers and artists and comedians, as a matter of fact, a whole wide spectrum of philosophers, scientists, have come from the Jewish culture, so it's really not about that. I just want to be someone who's actually going to take a sober approach to some of these discussions about Israel that are very controversial and need to be addressed a little more dryly. And so I've already talked about racism and propaganda and the use of experimental and extremely lethal weapons. And this video is going to examine the common comparisons that you see, especially all over the internet, between Zionists, the Israelis, and the Nazis. And I know this is what appears to be a very inflammatory topic, but like I say, I want to approach it rationally and see what we can find in these comparisons, because in some respects it's a fair comparison, and in other respects it's not. And I'll get to some of the comparisons first. So first of all, one of the big comparisons recently has been the comparison between the Warsaw Ghetto that the Nazis created in Poland and the way the Israelis have treated Gaza. And with the Warsaw Ghetto, we had 1.3 square miles with 400,000 Jews put into this small area. And eventually the ghetto was razed after 2 years, but it was sustained for 2 years, which is a long time, and certainly in the Nazi scheme of things. 30% of the population of Warsaw was herded into 2.4% of the city, and it was completely closed off from the outside world 7 months after it was created. And a wall was built around the Warsaw Ghetto, 9.8 feet high, and escapees were shot on sight. Borders fluctuated over the years within the ghetto, and the ghetto was actually split into two parts. And so there was an artery needed to connect two parts of the ghetto to continue to keep it isolated. And so that's a very interesting comparison there. Certainly, we have Gaza, which is 25 miles long by something like 8 miles, and has nearly 2 million Palestinians living in it. So that's somewhat comparable. And the fact that a giant wall has been built around it. In the case of Israel, they built one 2 or 3 times higher than even the one the Germans built around the Warsaw Ghetto. And of course, anyone who tries to climb the wall out of Gaza will be shot on sight, just like in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the Warsaw Ghetto was completely closed off from the outside world, and Gaza has been nearly completely closed off from the outside world. And 30% of Warsaw was herded into the ghetto. We have something, depending on what part of history you go to, we can have 100% to 50%, 100%, 80% of all the Palestinian population of Israel has all been herded into a very small percentage of the country. So that's also fairly comparable. And an area was created in the ghetto where Jews collaborated with the Nazis and dominated. And so we also have a situation where we have collaborators in a sense, we have Palestinian police forces who are supported by the efforts of the United States, who is the sponsor of Israel, which creates an interesting dynamic. And we also have the Warsaw Ghetto split into two sections, joined by an artery. While in Israel, we have the West Bank and Gaza, but not necessarily held together by any kind of artery. So there is some certainly some similarities there. And if one looks at the pictures of the Warsaw Ghetto after it was razed by the Nazis, then we also know that the pictures of the destruction of Gaza are also very comparable to what we saw there. But let's get back to the Warsaw Ghetto a little bit. So the Warsaw Ghetto, much like the way Gaza runs, was a city in itself, had hospitals, schools, refugee centers, orphanages, and soup kitchens, of course, all of which ended up getting bombed and shelled and machine gunned. And certainly we see that same thing happening in Gaza. And then we actually had a Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943 because since they were all herded into this ghetto and were under occupation, they actually rose up. They dared to resist, and over 600 were shot and 5,000 were rounded up, and then they even demolished the great synagogue of Warsaw. So we see comparable. I understand something in the vicinity of 80 mosques in Gaza have been destroyed, and we also see this feeble attempt to defend themselves by Hamas, taking these primitive rockets, which have created very few fatalities, and the only Israelis they can kill are the ones that actually come in after them. And we see the same thing in the Warsaw Ghetto. I mean, the Nazis actually had to come in and could sustain casualties in this uprising, but for the most part, they eventually just systematically destroyed the city and rounded up everyone there and shipped them off to camps or killed them. And a lot of times during that time, they could control the power and water coming in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto, and that's something else that we see in Gaza as well as the systematic destruction of buildings and roundup of individuals at will. We have plenty of instances, including just before this latest Gaza offensive, of Palestinians just being rounded up at various times and herded off. So then in the ghetto, Warsaw Ghetto, we also had the German administration gets a segment of the ghetto to collaborate in administration and police. It created a Jewish ghetto police in the Warsaw Ghetto. So ironic that Israel would now create a Palestinian ghetto police force to keep order in Gaza. And in the Warsaw Ghetto, we had disease and starvation, and poverty kept the population stable, even as newcomers constantly arrived. And I'm sure that's certainly true of Gaza as well. I'm sure there's a great amount of disease and starvation and poverty. There certainly will be after the latest aggressive actions there. And then the Nazis kept a calorie count for everyone living in the Warsaw Ghetto. So food was rationed at 184 calories allowed daily. And apparently the Israeli government has done the same thing in the past. I'm not sure if it's a constant policy of doing a calorie count. So the blockade only allows enough food to sustain individuals. And so a calorie count was used. And then in the Warsaw Ghetto, like I say, it was a functioning city. And unemployment was very high, and goods had to be smuggled in and out. So that's also very similar to the Gaza ghetto. Unemployment is something like 34%, if not higher. I think 80% of the population lives on aid from outside the country, and the water is barely potable. And of course, everything had to be smuggled in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto, and also has to be smuggled in and out of the Gaza Ghetto. And the Warsaw Ghetto, of course, had to create a whole new set of industries to sustain itself for 2 years. one giant black market, and all the industries that existed before and all the artisans that were in the Warsaw Ghetto couldn't exercise their normal trades because, of course, none of those goods were available. And that's what we also find in Gaza, that 95% of industry there cannot function because they cannot get the materials they need because of the blockade to sustain their normal activities. So there's at least a look at the comparisons between the Warsaw Ghetto and the Gaza Ghetto, and there are some very stark similarities, and the fact that there are segments of the Israeli government talking about final solutions gets a little nervous, makes me a little nervous hearing that sort of thing, because right now that's the only thing that separates the Gaza ghetto and the Warsaw Ghetto. So I think it's a fairly legitimate argument, although it's a little dramatic, but it makes a point. And I think that's to look at the way an assault like this, and the way Israel has had this blockade for 7 years, and just the whole sequence of events leading up to where the Palestinians find themselves now. And another ways that it has been argued that the Israelis are particularly the Zionists, has a kinship to Nazism is a number of other techniques that they compare. One is the use of overwhelming firepower, particularly on civilians, and it's an interesting argument, but you can make that argument against any number of nations throughout history. So it's not something necessarily to pin on Israel, although it is very notable that they use that technique, particularly having had it used on them. And then we find that both the Nazis and Israel uses a lot of false flag events to further their foreign policy, and a lot of it's pretty deceptive and pretty lurid, including the USS Liberty event and things like that. But once again, every nation in the world uses those techniques, particularly the big players, so that's nothing new. The rampant demonization and racism, to the importance of propaganda, both those go hand in hand. And once again, a reasonable comparison, because the Nazis in Israel both have a very mindful relationship with propaganda, and knew how it worked and exploited it to its maximum. And demonization is part of that. But once again, it's just ironic that Israel would end up using these very techniques from their former captors. And the use of civilian targets and proportional executions, justifying 100 Arab deaths for every Israeli death, and just as the Nazis would execute 100 citizens for every German soldier killed in certain areas, and then bombing urban areas, certainly a technique that both the Nazis and Israel and the Zionists use. But once again, that's another thing that all countries do, as it serves their purposes, and certainly in the 20th century and 21st century, it's just part of the landscape. And then, oddly enough, one of the biggest comparisons between the Zionists and the Nazis is systemic racism and segregation, and that gets whittling it down a little bit more now when you have the systemic codified racism and segregation, and that can be a very direct correlation between Nazi philosophy and Zionist philosophy, and you don't really find that in a lot of countries, but certainly not in the modern world and the developed world. And then we also have a similarity in the fact that the Germans justified their expansion and confiscation of other countries' lands by calling it Lebensraum, or living space, living room. And the Jews used a similar term called land redemption. And so when they bought land or took land away from Arabs, and it became settled by Jews, then it'd be called land redemption. And part of that terminology is interesting too, because it ties into the other similarities that we see between Nazi philosophy and Zionist philosophy, using these historical, mystical, and religious evocations in order to create this mythology. A lot of the symbols and rituals used by the Nazi state are pretty similar to what we see in Israel, but once again, we can see similarities between these institutions around the world. So that's not necessarily a compelling argument in itself. Although one of the similarities that makes me the most nervous is the whole Zionist philosophy of the chosen people and being against all non-Jews, and that's very much close to the Nazi argument for the master race and exclusion of anyone who is not Aryan. And that could almost be a topic for an entire video in itself. And then, of course, the resistance to the Nazis. If you were resisting the Nazis, you referred to them as freedom fighters. But if you were the Nazis, of course, you referred to them as terrorists, Jewish terrorists and Bolshevik terrorists. And so we find Israel using the same demonization of what would be seen as freedom fighters in the Arab world, are labeled as terrorists in the pro-Zionist world. And so there's some other similarities, and we have this Israeli narrative of an insurgency when it's actually has a lot more similarities to an occupation and colonialism, and that's something to remember, something to factor in when looking at this complex situation between the Palestinians and Israel. It's easy to buy into the Israeli narrative of an insurgency within their country, but you have to always look at all the events that unfold there in a context, in a historical context, in what is actually a relatively recent historical context, and then the narrative becomes more about colonialism and occupation. And there's just no other way to look at that. And then we have the whole idea of concentration camp, and there's people that have discussed the way the Palestinians have ended up rounded up, akin to being concentration camp, and that's quite a stretch to make that comparison as well, because when we have systematic labor death camps, and that's what their purpose was. It's a far cry from Gaza in so many ways. I can't even go into it. And then another way that one could argue that there's a similarity between Nazism and Zionism is the justification in Nazi Germany of the confiscation of the assets of the Jews that they were expelling and executing, and then redistributing them amongst the Germans, German citizens, who were more than happy to get these new rewards and didn't want to think about where they came from. And we see that same mentality in Israel and Zionism, where all these assets were confiscated, continue to be confiscated from Arabs and Palestinians, and then redistributed, and all the wealth of the country redistributed to the Jewish population. So there's definitely a fair comparison there, and unique enough that it's a compelling argument. And then we have the fact that every citizen in Israel is required to carry his papers. It's an ID book in Hebrew, and you can be arrested and held for 16 days just for not having your papers. And that's also a comparison to Nazi Germany, but once again, not a hugely compelling argument, because there's a lot of countries that use that kind of system. I guess it's just the fact that we expect better from a close ally of the United States who call themselves a liberal democracy. And then we have to remember that many Zionists worked with the Nazis against other Jews, and to move more people to Palestine, and the entire complicated history of Nazi Germany actually being part of the settlement and setting up of Palestine, this is also well documented. So the first solution for Nazi Germany was actually to see if they could just move all the Jews somewhere else, and they had the same idea of setting up a colony or a new state in Palestine, and so a lot of Zionists worked very closely with the Nazis for a long time, and were instrumental in getting some of the Palestinian settlements, Jewish settlements, rolling in the 20s and 30s, well, the 30s. So, so anyway, that's an argument. Like I say, most people use it for hyperbole. I'm trying to just approach it a little more soberly, so that when these things come up, I have something to post. And we also have it's interesting that the United States and even Europe are happy to demonize all these despots all over the world and call them the next Hitler, and sometimes with far less evidence of being similar to Nazis or like Hitler than a number of Israeli policies. And we have U.S. corporations were complicit with Nazi Germany, and U.S. corporations are complicit with Israel, and they don't really put any moral restraints on them. And I brought this up before. It's kind of interesting that Israel, in spite of using the Holocaust as an industry, as a cottage industry, is the fact that you would think that Israel would have some strained relationship with Germany, or would have a strained relationship with Daimler, or a lot of German corporations, or would have a strained relationship with IBM, who helped create the systems to create the systems to keep track in concentration camps. We have, I'm sure Israel doesn't have a strained relationship with Ford, who is notable in their support of Hitler. So that's a little more complicated. But anyway, so there we have it. Just an overview of these comparisons that are made between Nazism and Zionism. And maybe I'm probably maybe even a lone voice trying to at least examine the issue soberly and come to a conclusion. And my conclusion is there are some interesting similarities, and they shouldn't be surprising, considering a lot of Israeli culture is born out of German Jewish pre-war and war culture. And the fact that they've absorbed some of this should be no surprise. And then in a lot of ways, even though the comparisons are interesting, certainly between Gaza and the Warsaw Ghetto, overall, I don't think Israel is worse or better than anyone else. Once again, I just want to hold them to the same standards as everyone else and take a look. But a lot of the stuff the comparisons are based on are things that nation states around the world use and have always used throughout history, including the United States, of course. So there we have it. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.